Welcome back to You're All Doomed, the podcast that slices and dices its way through Friday the 13th, the final chapter, 13 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Brian.
I'm Zaxxon Prodigy Greg.
This chunk begins with Nurse Morgan going through the supply room and ends with the Doublemint twins on bicycles. So Nurse Morgan is taking her inventory in the supply room, and she reaches for the top shelf for some reason and knocks a few bottles off, and she gets all flustered. And the only reason why I'm mentioning this is because I'm still expecting things falling off shelves to be in 3D, and I'm trying to make notes of things that 3D effects. And so when it fell, I was like, well, maybe that was one. And then we cut to Axel, who is doing what Nurse Morgan told him to do a long time ago, which is to put the body on ice, and he's sliding Jason's body into one of those cold lockers. And I decided to do a little bit of research on cold lockers to see, what their purpose was. There's a positive temperature cold locker that keeps bodies between 36 degrees Fahrenheit and 39 degrees. And while this is usually used for keeping bodies for up to several weeks, it does not prevent decomposition, which continues at a slower rate than at room temperature. And then there's also negative temperature cold lockers where bodies are kept between 14 degrees Fahrenheit and negative 58. These are usually used as forensic institutes, particularly when a body has not been identified. At these temperatures, the body is completely frozen and decomposition is significantly reduced, but not prevented. It's not really clear which one Jason is going into, but it's cold enough that as Axel is done sliding the body into the locker, we see this very faint cloud of cold breath rise up from Jason's body.
Yes, and I noticed that Axel also doesn't take care to properly latch the door, but I chuckle to think what would have happened if he, in fact, had latched the door shut, and just how pissed off Jason would have gotten if he'd been stuck in there for days.
Well, this is the final chapter.
It's the end of the movie.
Right. Just going back to that cloud of cold breath for a second, I remember not noticing that until maybe the first time that I watched it on DVD, which, I don't know, may have been 10 years ago. Up until that point, I'd been watching it on, like a shitty TV on cable, or maybe on VHS on the same shitty TV. But this is the first time that I was probably watching it on a decent HD TV and just noticing the little detail, because it's pretty quick. And if you're not looking for it, you don't notice it, but it's just like this little, all you see is the silhouette of Jason going into the locker, and there's this little cloud of breath that just pops up right before the door mostly closes all the way.
Yeah, it was nice and creepy, and like you, it was years after the first time I saw this that I even noticed that. So that was cool. Axel sits back down and flicks from the news back to his workout video and starts perving out on the TV.
He spills his cup of coffee that he's drinking, and he leans forward to clean it up, but before he can, your boy Jason grabs him from behind and slices his throat with a hacksaw.
Boom. Yeah, Axel gets a bone saw to the neck, and then his head is completely turned around backwards.
Yeah, the hacksaw wasn't enough. We're going to turn your head around 270, maybe even 360 degrees.
This is really Jason stepping up his brutality, improvising with what he finds on hand and just going to town. It's a great effect. Right off the bat, Tom Savini is showing his A game with a really horrific, disgusting display of gore. But again, it's, quickly edited, so your mind is probably adding more to it than you're actually seeing. But hot damn.
So R.I.P. Axel. Axel Burns, for those of you playing along at home. Burns is a name we might be hearing again in the near future.
Axel was played by an actor named Bruce Mahler, and 1984 was a big year for him. He played Fackler in the first Police Academy movie.
He played in 4 Police Academy movies. He was in the first, the second, the third, and then he took a little break and came back for the 6th.
Was that the Mission to Moscow?
I have no idea. Why would I know that?
Well, that's going to be our next podcast series, Brian. He also had a recurring role on Seinfeld many years later. But he's also another alum from Different Strokes. So a lot of people coming from that series.
The Law and Order and CSI of the 1980s, where everyone had at least one role in that show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had completely forgotten that he played Rabbi Glickman in a few episodes of Seinfeld. It's funny to kind of look back on this in hindsight, where I don't think I noticed that, because I used to watch Seinfeld all the time, and I've seen those episodes multiple times. And as soon as I saw who he was, I'm like, oh yeah, of course he was the rabbi.
So that's two people who've gone on to the clergy because didn't Harold go on to officiate Chandler and Monica's wedding
He
on
did,
Friends?
yes, that's right.
So
I mentioned in the last episode Axel's little rant where he starts screaming, "Holy Jesus, jumping Christmas shit." It was actually used in a song called "The Devil Made Me Do It" by Frankenstein drag queens from Planet 13. I'm sure everyone's heard of them. But yeah, here's a little clip.
The devil made me do it and I'll do it again. The devil made me do it and I'll do it again.
Holy Jesus, goddamn! Holy Jesus, jumping Christmas shit!
he doesn't have any credits since the year 2000. Reportedly, he took time off to raise a family and breed border terriers. So good for him. We cut back to Nurse Morgan, still in the supply room, and there's a pretty conspicuous sign that says that the room is not approved for the use of combustible anesthetics. So hopefully that's not what she just dropped and smashed all over the floor.
And then suddenly it becomes very difficult for Nurse Morgan to sweep up the glass on the floor because all the lights in the room turn out. And of course she thinks it's Axel, the joker that he is. And she says, read my lips, leave me alone. So again, can't quite get a read on her. But out of nowhere, Jason grabs Nurse Morgan by the face and throws her up against the wall and then stabs her in the chest with like a pair of scissors or maybe a knife. It's kind of hard to tell what it is.
It might even be like a shard of metal. I'm really not sure what he's using there, but he does. He stabs her and then he rips her down the middle.
Yeah, he fillets her like a fish right down to the belly button.
That's just painful looking.
So R.I.P. Nurse Morgan. Her full name was Roberta or Robbie Morgan, which was an homage to actress
cute.
Robbie Morgan, who played Annie in the original Friday the 13th.
That's adorable.
Yeah, if you look at her name tag, it does say R. Morgan, so it checks out.
That's very cute. She was portrayed by actress Lisa Freeman, who had a role in Mr. Mom. She's credited as Motorhead. I accidentally, or not accidentally, but I watched that movie recently enough that I did not go back because of this and watch it again, but I don't remember who that character is, but at some point in the future I'll watch that movie again. It's awesome, and I'll keep an eye out for her. She was also prominently featured in the Back to the Future series, the first and second parts. I have a great screenshot of her in a scene with Crispin Glover, who appears in this movie later on. She was also in a movie called Savage Streets that was directed by Danny Steinman, who we'll talk about next season. And most importantly, she had a role on our favorite sitcom of all time, Double Trouble.
Yeah. Her father, Leonard Freeman, created and produced Hawaii Five-0, the original one, not the one with Boomer from Battlestar Galactica. She also wrote a young adult surf fiction novel called Honey Girl. The premise of the book is how to survive California's hottest surf spot. Never go anywhere without a bathing suit. Never cut your hair. Never let them see you panic. And then she wrote a follow-up to the book called Riptide Summer.
Yeah, it seems like she's gone on to a career as a writer, illustrator, and spoken word artist. So she kind of found a different niche than acting, but still probably using some of her skills. We cut away from that carnage to a woman and her daughter jogging. This is Trish and Mrs. Jarvis, who are having a chat while they exercise for the day.
Yeah, Trish tells her mother that she had recently talked to her father and that he wants to come out and visit them. So we can kind of presume that they're divorced because Mrs. Jarvis suddenly becomes interested in the fact that he wants to come out and visit them. Mrs. Jarvis proposes that maybe she and Trish could go out and visit him instead. And Trish responds, "I think you're getting horny." And I can't imagine a more uncomfortable thing to say to my mother or my father for that matter. Like, could you ever imagine saying something like that?
To your mother?
The thing that it reminds me of is when I was a kid, I was over at your house one day and
I don't want to know where you're going with this.
and your mother walked in. No. And we were getting ready to go to a movie or go to the mall or something. And I wanted to borrow some money. And I picked up the phone. I just lived across the street, but I picked up the phone to kind of, give my mom a heads up, and I wanted to borrow some money. And so me being, Mr. Cool Guy that I am, I was going to call up and say, "Hey, Mom, can I borrow a C note?" And, not that she was going to give me $100. She was probably going to give me like $20, but I just thought it was funny. Except when I picked up the phone and said, "Hey, Mom, can I have a G-spot?"
And I remember hearing my mom in the other room just bust out laughing.
Yeah, and I think I was in silence for at least, 20 seconds after that, because I don't even know how to recover or how to correct myself. And I think I maybe even just hung up and just been like, I guess I'll just go to the movie without money.
Good solution.
And things have never been the same between me and my mother.
This was 6 months ago.
Right.
I'm intrigued by the mention of a Mr. Jarvis. I feel like there's a lost fan fiction opportunity there. Maybe if they ever revive this series and one or both of the Jarvis kids return, they could bring their dad with them to help them deal with the ordeal they face.
It also makes me wonder why they got divorced, because they both seem pretty fond of him, and Mrs. Jarvis in particular seems intrigued by the idea that he wants to come visit, or they're going to go visit him. So what were the circumstances of the divorce? And
yeah, or there's any number of ways this could go. Like, is he in some sort of institution for someone who's disabled in some ways? Was he injured in an accident and needs assisted living? So he's insisted that his family, live comfortably while he's in a facility that can care for him. Or it's a very weird situation. But the bottom line is we have a single mom with her 2 children, and we see that second child in this next scene where he is inside the house playing a computer game.
the game is Zaxxon. It was developed by Sega in 1982. Basically, the object of the game is to hit as many targets as possible without being shot down or running out of fuel.
It was an isometric video game, which means it's kind of filmed from a 3-point perspective that was unusual. It's not straight from on top or behind. It's got kind of a 3D effect to it that was popular. The game itself, I was never a particularly big fan of. I thought it was repetitive and kind of boring, but it was cool to play for, a few minutes at least.
It was the first arcade game to be advertised on television with a commercial produced by Paramount Pictures for $150,000. So suddenly it makes sense why its placement is in this movie.
Tommy is sitting there wearing what appears to be an alien mask, which I guess is not unusual because his mother and sister seem very unfazed by this as they come into the house. He hears them and proclaims that he's scored 98,000 on Zaxxon. His mom asks how many robots that is. He says it's 35. I was curious if that was good or not, so I looked up the stats on Zaxxon.
Well, one thing I thought that was interesting about that scene is that he really did have 98,000 points. Like, I looked at the screen and he was playing the game, so it wasn't just like it was on pause and they, could have shot that scene 5 or 6 times and the score would have been the same. Like, he was in the middle of a game and playing. And now that could have very well been the first take of that scene, but I just thought it was interesting that they were still aligning his dialogue with his real-time score on the screen. But that was the first thing that I noticed.
So I found myself wondering if 98,000 is a particularly good score for Zaxxon, and it turns out it's kind of not. The high score on a home console is listed at 339,750, and on the arcade cabinet it's over 4 million. So 98,000 is kind of a drop in the bucket. And in terms of the number of robots, I mean, there are some robots as boss characters in this game, but primarily you're shooting cannons and other ships and stuff. So it's just sort of, clearly a screenwriter's lazy attempt at summarizing the, arcade games of the 80s. And most parents probably just assume that you're defending or blowing up universes and fighting robots.
But Tommy's game ends too soon thanks to his mother's distraction, and he's a little frustrated, but she tells him to go upstairs to play the game, but he can't because he needs a bypass patch cord.
Which I Googled, and the first 3 hits were related to this movie, so I still don't know what a bypass patch cord does. But I think they're clearly trying to establish Tommy as kind of a geek, a tech nerd perhaps, and then, he's obviously got this alien mask that he's wearing. So, he's a kid who probably spends a little bit of time on his own, and especially if they're out in the middle of nowhere like they seem to be. Not a ton of kids around his age.
Yeah, I mean, Tommy does mention that he made that alien mask on his own, and Mrs. Jarvis kind of compliments it on him, and she says something like he customized this one himself, and which I didn't really understand, because isn't that the point of making a mask yourself? The whole point is that it's customized to you.
Or he purchased it off the shelf and then made some improvements on it or something
That could
like that.
be, yeah.
I presume that Tom Savini made that mask. I can't imagine that with him at their disposal, they would go and buy anything from Clown Alley.
Back to the patch cord real quick. Mrs. Jarvis tells Tommy that he and Trish can go into town and maybe pick up a patch cord so he can play the game upstairs. But while he's in town, he should also get a haircut, because he's, kind of a shaggy haired kid, and maybe it's time for him to get a haircut.
They established that Tommy is not particularly good at locking the door to the house. That may pay off later, but there's an amusing exchange where Mrs. Jarvis says, what happens if a psycho wanders in? And Trish pipes up with a little jab that says, challenge into a game of Zaxxon. And I think I'm going to try and draw that cartoon, because I want to see a picture of Jason playing Zaxxon with Tommy.
For some reason, Trish asks about the place next door, the house next door, and her mom says that it's been rented by 6 kids. And I have no idea how she would have heard that. I don't know if this is just like a rental property that's always been next to them, but I don't know if it's like a neighborhood watch meeting or something that she heard it, but she knows that 6 kids are apparently going to rent this house next door. And Trish says something along the lines that it'll be nice to have some company next door. And her mom flashes Tommy a look, like a knowing glance, that kind of suggests she's like, that girl's going to get some dick.
So they're a sex-obsessed family.
Right.
So then we cut to the Griswold family truckster, where we have the 6 teens in question singing, school bus songs as they're on their way to their getaway.
Because there's really only one way to introduce a group of teens in a Friday the 13th movie, and that's A, sitting in a car driving down the road, and B, singing some sort of random song.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's some random song that I wasn't familiar with, but they're all singing along to it, and they're going, country boy, sitting in the grass. Along came a prairie dog and crawled right up his ass. I dug around and was trying to find if this was a real song or if it was just made up for the movie. There's variations of it that exist. There's one that says, country boy, sitting on a rock. Along came a bumblebee and stung him on the cock. So there's, maybe they're just making up their own version as they go along. But yeah, it was just another random song that they were singing. So while we're talking about prairie dogs crawling up asses, and because I was discussing Richard Gere earlier.
Oh, Jesus.
There was an urban legend. I couldn't even pinpoint the year, but there was an urban legend that Richard Gere was admitted into the emergency room with a foreign object lodged up his rectum, and that object was a gerbil. Depending on who was relaying the story at the time, there was certain flourishes that would be added for dramatic purposes, but there was never really been any evidence that this was even remotely true, but I feel like it's just something that everyone knew. And this was way pre-internet days, and so it's just impressive that this is kind of this ubiquitous urban legend that somehow made the rounds. And
yeah, I was always told by someone like, a friend of mine works in an ER and they told me blah, blah, blah. You never hear a first-hand account like, I'm the one who removed the gerbil. It's not true. I think he's gone on the record denying it, but he refuses to speak about it anymore. So,
So anyway, there's 6 people in this station wagon. The driver is Paul. In the front seat next to him is Doug. The girl from Weird Science is sitting in the middle. Her name is Samantha. And then once again, we see Sarah Jessica Parker show up in a Friday the 13th movie. Oddly enough, her name really is Sarah. And then the way back is Ted and Crispin Glover.
Yeah, I've got some questions about the relationship between these people. To me, perhaps we're only just being introduced to them, so it's premature to discuss this, but I don't feel like there's a whole lot that comes to light as the movie goes on. So I feel comfortable talking about it while we have all 6 of them together with no other characters around. It seems to me as though Paul and or Sam are sort of the hub of this group of people. They're in a relationship. and they seem to be the central unit upon which all of the other people come to this group. So, riding shotgun is Doug, and I feel like he's probably Paul's Chewbacca. He's his right-hand man. Sam, is in the backseat with her BFF, Sarah, and that all makes sense. I can't figure out what these two dildos are doing in the way back, and the only thing I can think of is that Ted is the new stepbrother of either Sam or Paul. And in order to get permission from his or her parent to take this weekend trip, they were forced to bring Ted along. And they were like, well, Ted sucks, but if he brings his weird friend Crispin Glover, maybe he'll come and, spring for beer or something, or, they'll go upstairs and masturbate while we all have fun downstairs. So that's the only thing that makes any sense to me, because those two guys do not seem to fit with this group at all.
Yeah, I like that theory. These movies always do a good job of introducing a very random collection of people and friends, but they never attempt to explain why they're friends or why they're all part of the same social circle, because they don't ever appear to really like each other. They're always at each other's throats or making fun of each other. And it just, I like your theory, because there's got to be a reason to bring them along. I definitely feel like the first two rows of the station wagon, it makes sense. Those, I could see those four people hanging out, but Ted and Crispin Glover, it's like, there's got to be some alternate reason why they're there. And I'll totally buy your theory.
And they're sitting in that way back, practically hanging out the rear window, having this really kind of awkward and painfully long discussion about being horny and just their sophomoric attempts with girls.
Yeah, Ted's criticizing Crispin Glover for breaking up with BJ Betty.
Wasn't that your nickname in college?
I just want to know what the BJ stands for. Crispin Glover tells Ted that he's not exactly sure what happened, but that he did all the right things and she still broke up with him. But Ted does this thing, and this is another reason why I don't really know why they're friends, because their interaction is so random and bizarre. But Ted starts to pretend that he's typing on some imaginary computer, like he's putting in a calculation of, what really happened. And it's just, him typing in the air and not doing anything. But the results from this, quote unquote computer just say that Crispin Glover is a dead fuck, a lousy lay, a dead pecker.
Yeah, so Ted tries to establish himself as some sort of love guru with his magical computer. And I'm not really sure why Crispin Glover buys into this at all. He seems annoyed by it, but at the same time, he seems devastated by the results. But it's just, that's so annoying.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is that this BJ Betty girl seems pretty popular for, I'm sure, very specific reasons. But the fact that she was with Crispin Glover for any extended period of time seems to put him ahead of Ted, who seemingly doesn't have a girlfriend and has no luck with women. So, Crispin has the upper hand here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, almost immediately, I feel like Ted comes off as sort of a high-functioning Elliot Rodgers style incel, and clearly has, very childish views about women and his entitlement to command them to do his bidding.
And Greg, since I know you're wondering, the car they're driving is a 1973 Chevrolet Caprice estate station wagon. It got an eco-friendly 11 miles per gallon.
Wow.
And somehow, inexplicably, topped out at 101 miles per hour. I would love to see this thing going 101 miles an hour down the road. It would probably run out of gas before it got there, but...
Interestingly enough, this badass station wagon cruises past a very makeshift-looking graveyard.
I wouldn't even call it a graveyard.
It's like a resting place, if nothing else. But the headstone that we see identifies the body below as Pamela Voorhees, which is the first time we learn her first name. We only ever knew her before this as Mrs. Voorhees. I don't understand this at all.
It's unclear if there were other gravestones there. Mrs. Voorhees' gravestone was certainly the most prominent one that was sticking up. Looks like there were some other stones or large rocks there that may have been some sort of grave marking, but it's literally off the side of the road. Like if you park the car on the side of the road and open your door, you're going to hit this gravestone. And I don't understand why she would be buried there. It doesn't appear to be.
It's almost like a roadside memorial from an accident victim,
Yeah, like
or
where
something.
someone would lay like some flowers for someone who got hit by a bike or something. But it's a very random location, and they're not very close to where they're going, because they're lost. That's why they pull over. They're looking at a map. So it's not like, oh, well, the entrance to Camp Crystal Lake is 100 yards from here. So, okay, you can argue that this is, the closest that they could bury her. We're seemingly miles away from wherever, Camp Crystal Lake is. And so forget the pure coincidence of the car stopping directly next to this gravestone. Like, I can't even begin to explain why this gravestone is there to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, all it really does is it accomplishes a callback to, the earlier movies in the series, to remind you that, Jason's mom died. It kind of locates them in the general area. So
I think that's its only purpose is, like, hey, we're getting close to all that stuff that happened before.
Yeah, we're not like in the next state or anything like that. I find it ironic that it's a headstone because, of course, as we know, she was decapitated. So, and Jason has the head, so it's not like her head is there. It's just this headless torso.
And who would have buried her?
And who would have buried her?
It's a nice gravestone. We can argue whether or not the location is a prime burial spot, but someone felt the need to bury her there.
I think we'll have similar questions in the future, perhaps, but we'll see. The other detail that jumped out at me is that Pamela Voorhees was indeed 49 years old at her death, which freaks me out just because my wife is now a year older than that.
Yeah, and she looked way older in that movie than 49.
I agree. And my wife looks a lot younger than 50, so.
After looking at the map, they determined that they're getting pretty close to where they need to, and they just need to go a couple more miles and then make a few more turns, and then they'll be where they're heading. But further down the road, we see a hitchhiker camped out, and it's Audrey from National Lampoon's European Vacation.
Yikes.
God, I miss Jack.
So, yeah, this is a weird hitchhiker. She's got kind of a mixture of goth / hippie with a flavor of Canada added in for a little extra spice.
Yeah, her sign says Canada and love. That's the sign that she's holding up as cars drive by. Ted yells from the back that they should pick her up, but Paul says that they don't have any room. And as they drive by, Ted yells, "Hey, honey, you got a sister?"
Rough. It's he's such a jackass.
Yeah.
And her Canada or love sign is then turned around to show "fuck you," and she gives them the finger. So
Which
good for her.
Yeah, she's probably used to people yelling stupid shit at her, and she was prepared to have a comeback, which I liked.
Yeah, I like this lady. She's awesome. And dejected from missing a ride, she goes back to her stuff by the side of the road and sits down. And good for her. She has a banana as a snack.
And she starts to eat the banana, and she hears a stick break behind her. But before she can turn around to see what it is, Jason grabs her by the hair and stabs her through the back of the neck. The knife comes out of her throat, and I feel like you can even hear Jason go, "oof," as he stabs her, like if you really listen closely. So I don't know if he was just kind of shocked by his own strength or maybe grossed out by, the result of his kill, but there's definitely some like audible noise that he makes when he stabs her.
I think it might even be the same metal shard that he used to kill Nurse Morgan, because it doesn't look necessarily like a knife blade to me, so it could have even been this piece of metal gouging his hand as it plunged into the back of her neck. But this death is my least favorite in any movie I've ever seen. It's something about the mixture of the mushed up banana in her mouth and the blood that's, it's so gross. It makes me gag every time I see it.
Not only is she choking on the banana in her mouth, but she's also pulverizing the leftover banana in her hand.
Yeah.
And then there's like a gurgling. And
it's the limp banana in her death squeeze it's just dick wilting. Ugh.
I have another problem with this kill, and I feel like this is the beginning of a trend that we're going to start to see moving forward, which is having a character introduced and almost immediately killed. It's the first time that we're really seeing a character that has not been built up in any way or
Disposable
even introduced.
character.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just like she's Hitchhiker. There's no name. We don't really know, why she's leaving Canada or is she heading to Canada. We know nothing about her. She was purely introduced to be killed. And again, that's a trend we're going to start to see moving forward, and it becomes problematic. But
I see what you mean. It doesn't bother me here, but what it means and what it leads to, you're right, is problematic.
it's more, it's the most senseless killing yet.
Yeah.
Like this person was not interfering with Jason's plans in any way. She was just sitting on the side of the road and Jason happened to be nearby and she gets killed immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And, her screen time is maybe 30 seconds before she's dead.
And yet the actor Bonnie Hellman, she's still working a ton. In fact, she was even on The League, which might get mentioned at some point in the future, as well as Glow, which I've been watching recently and love. So I have to go back and try and find her in an episode.
She was also in 19 episodes of the short-lived soap opera Sunset Beach, which we're going to hear about a little bit later.
And according to Wikipedia, she was very popular in high school, so good for her.
What a weird thing to have added to your Wikipedia bio. I feel like her mother added that or something.
Yeah, or like people from her class added that as a joke, like it's totally not true.
We end up back at the Jarvis house, and they're getting ready to eat dinner. But there is an absolutely enormous giant pitcher of orange juice sitting on the counter. And Trish is bummed because she thought they were having pizza, but instead they're having tuna salad on iceberg lettuce, which makes the fact that orange juice is out even more disgusting. I can't imagine eating tuna fish and drinking orange juice.
Maybe Mrs. Jarvis is really worried about them getting scurvy.
It could be. And then Mrs. Jarvis says the most mom thing possible and says that she's actually in the mood for a Jarvis sandwich.
I wouldn't mind being part of a Jarvis sandwich.
It depends who's the bread. But
Yeah, so they sandwich Tommy between them, and he protests as any 12-year-old boy probably would when being squooshed by his mom and his sister.
Tommy thinks he hears something at the door, so he opens it up, and it's their dog. I'm not 100% certain, but I think his name is Gordon, because when Tommy sees him, he says, "Gordon, hey, Gordon, where have you been, Gordon? Listen, Gordon, we'll talk later."
Yeah, they pretty clearly established that this dog's name is Gordon. I actually have a plant in my house that I've named Gordon. Part of me wonders if subconsciously I named it after this dog.
But as Tommy is wrangling up, I think the dog's name was Gordon, he sees a station wagon full of kids pull up to the house next door.
Yeah, and you mentioned this earlier, and it's still just it brings up the fact that it's bizarre that there's this rental party house right next door to a private residence in the middle of nowhere. So I almost wonder if, Paul or Sam, if their parents own this as a vacation summer home or something and told the kids they could use it for a weekend, or I can't imagine that this is not someone's domicile, and maybe that's how Mrs. Jarvis heard about it. Maybe the owner called to say, hey, my son and his friends are coming for the weekend.
Or they use the Airbnb app on their phones or something to reserve it.
Trish and Tommy go out to greet their new neighbors, leaving Mrs. Jarvis behind. She's looking out the window with a very strange expression on her face. It's kind of almost like a longing jealousy or concern, or I'm not quite sure what's going through her mind.
Yeah,
there.
she's like, I wonder what it's like to have friends.
Or maybe she's just thinking about how horny she is.
Right. Which one of those guys is going to fuck my daughter? Yeah, but as everyone's getting out of the car, Ted is still giving Crispin Glover shit and calling him a dead fuck, and Tommy makes sure that he introduces the dog. He tells him his name is Gordon. And then we cut to inside the, we'll just call it the party house next door to the Jarvises. Sarah and Samantha are having a conversation about sex and what the sleeping arrangements are going to be for the weekend. And it's kind of established that Sarah seems like the sweet and innocent one, while Samantha has a quote unquote reputation, even though she swears she's only sleeping with Paul.
Right, but she says that she got this reputation in 5th grade, which, yikes. I don't want to know the circumstances of that.
Yeah, let's not dig into that one.
But yeah, the fact that Ted and Crispin Glover, and now Sam and Sarah are having all these sex conversations. This is the most Porky's-esque, sex-obsessed movie in the series so far. That seems like all these kids are talking about. So,
Well, maybe if you weren't such a dead fuck, you wouldn't have a problem with it.
fair enough. I'm glad you checked your computer. We cut back over to the Jarvis household where Mrs. Jarvis is lounging on the sofa reading the Wessex County Register, which presumably is a fake newspaper. I would love to have that prop because the headline is "Mass Murderer's Body Missing." So clearly, you know,
And the subhead is "Police Investigate Missing Body."
covering the same ground twice. I guess that means we don't necessarily know how much time has passed since the hospital scene. Could be as much as a few days.
That's true. We don't know that. I mean, we know that Jason has had enough time to get out of the morgue and make his way over to wherever we are, but we don't know how far away that is. We know at least it's in the same county.
Right.
But yeah, that's true. I guess I just figured it was the following morning, you know, assuming that he killed Axel and Nurse Morgan at night, and then he gets out, and now he's made his way over there.
And so the evening edition of the paper says that the body's missing. I mean, that's certainly what I assumed. It, you know, it might
it's
be
a little timing is a little tight, but
it's definitely in the recent past. It might be 2 days later or something like that. There's a really freaky demon frog ashtray or something that's on the end table next to Mrs. Jarvis's head. The thing is, it's got this really angry expression. It almost looks like Zool from Ghostbusters.
Mrs. Jarvis is definitely concerned by, you know, the news that she sees in the paper, and Trish decides that she's going to go to bed and kind of snaps Mrs. Jarvis out for a second. She goes, she reminds Trish to get up at 6 a.m. for once around the lake, which probably doesn't mean what I think it means.
I do think that there's some decent mother-daughter acting going on here. They do seem very natural. I don't know how much of that was scripted versus improvised, but yeah, it just seems like a genuine relationship, and I like this little moment.
Yeah, I think it's like a mom and, you know, daughter sticking together after, you know, dad or, you know, husband has left, and so they kind of have to have a nice relationship, you know, maybe for Tommy's sake, but yeah, they're definitely kind of a tight-knit family.
Upstairs, Tommy is wearing his jammies. It's night time for him, but he notices out the window that he can see into the party house. And it just so happens that it's Samantha's room, and she begins getting ready for bedtime herself.
This is probably a good time to point out that Tommy is played by Corey Feldman. The only reason why I bring that up now is because I can't decide if it's Tommy Jarvis or Corey Feldman that's super excited to see Samantha undressing next door.
Yeah, he's definitely into it. Probably a little bit of both. I can't say I blame him. She's a nice looking young lady.
Right, but I mean, he's
getting carried
screaming
away.
into his pillow. He's headbutting his bed and
He's
kicking
bouncing
his
up
legs up
and
in the
down
air.
like a gorilla or something. It's a little weird. The fact that he's wearing jammies is makes it particularly unsettling for me.
But his moment of excitement is interrupted when Mrs. Jarvis walks in, but Tommy immediately pretends that he's asleep. And as she's placing the blanket over Tommy, she notices what his vantage point is, and that, you know, he can see directly out the window and can now see Sam and Paul making out. And Mrs. Jarvis just kind of smiles, you know, like, oh, boys will be boys, and then, you know, closes the blinds to his room.
I kind of can't blame Tommy for being excited, though, because think back to how hard it was to see tits when we were that age in that era.
I mean, I remember looking out my bedroom window trying to get a glance of you across the street, and no, you're right. Like, their house is pretty rural, so it's possible that they didn't even have cable, so they're working with just an antenna television. You're definitely not going to see any nudity there. His father's not around, so he can't steal his Playboy magazines or anything.
I mean,
so,
there was
yeah.
no internet. There was, you know, kids these days can find nudity at the drop of a hat. But
Yeah, I'm not
you know,
blaming him. I just feel like his reaction is maybe not as restrained as mine would have been if I was in the same
he definitely
situation.
wasn't playing it cool. That's for sure.
We cut to the next morning, and Sarah, Samantha, Paul, and Doug are walking in the woods. And once again, Ted and Crispin Glover are pulling up the rear in the way back, having their own little conversation, and Crispin Glover is wondering if he should call BJ Betty when they get into town, and Ted assures him that that would be a dead fuck thing to do. So he's just not letting up on this. But thankfully, just then, two girls, they're twins, they're dressed identically, of course, show up on the trail riding bikes. And that's where we leave off with this one.
Yeah. The death count in this episode is a whopping 3. We've got Axel, Nurse Morgan, and the hitchhiker all being taken care of by our boy Jason. That's all I've got. Anything else from you, Brian?
No, that's it.
All right. Then once again, I've been Greg.
And I'm Brian.
And you are all dude.